Welcome, everybody. I hope your December is off to a great start, and it's so good to have you here today. And as I do every single week, let me give a big shout out to those of you joining us by video at our Clark Summit campus and at our Wilkes-Barre campus. And I'm so thrilled that we can be one church in 3 locations so that we can all worship where we live and make a difference in our own communities, and yet come together every week so that we can learn and grow as one church here in northeastern Pennsylvania. So wherever you happen to be right now, great to have you with us. Today we're beginning a new teaching series that will lead us right up to Christmas. And what we're doing is we're using a very well-known Christmas story, a Christmas carol, as the launching point for these messages. And before I jump in today, I thought it might be helpful just to know some of the background to this particular story. The story, A Christmas Carol, was actually written back in 1843, and it was written by this guy right here, Charles Dickens. And Charles Dickens was a very interesting man. He was actually a follower of Christ. He was a Christian. In fact, in his last will and testament, he said this: "I commit my soul to the mercy of God through our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ." But even though he was a believer, even though he was a follower of Christ, he had a very negative opinion of organized religion. Because he looked around in his day and he saw people who called themselves Christians but didn't really live out their faith in any kind of practical way. He looked at the world in which he lived in London, and he saw people who were becoming more and more successful, but the poor were being completely forgotten. And he saw people who were pursuing success and pursuing wealth at the expense of their most important relationships. And he saw a church, the church of his day, that had become inwardly focused and become indifferent to the suffering outside of its walls. And so he actually wrote this story as a rebuke, as a wake-up call to the people of his day. And obviously it became very, very popular. The book has not gone out of print since he wrote it over 170 years ago. And there are more than 25 different movie versions of the story, A Christmas Carol. And so what we're doing in these weeks leading up to Christmas is we're using this well-known Christmas story as a starting point for every message as we talk about how the real message of Christmas can make a difference in your past and in your present and in your future. So today, as we begin this series, I want to talk about the power of your past. I want to talk about the fact that our past can have the ability to hold us captive and prevent us from realizing the future that God may have for us. Let me begin with Charles Dickens' story, A Christmas Carol. Toward the beginning of the story, there's one of 3 spirits, and this is where the story begins because it revolves around Ebenezer Scrooge, who was a very wealthy and successful businessman, but his wealth had become his god. It began to control him, and it turned him into a very bitter and lonely and greedy person. All that changes, though, when he is visited by these 3 spirits: the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And so the very first ghost shows up, and he takes Ebenezer Scrooge back in time to some of the places and the events that have shaped his life and formed him. In the first place he begins is in a boarding school where Ebenezer Scrooge, as a little boy, is there on Christmas Day all alone. All of the other kids at the boarding school have gone home, but he's still there because his mother died in childbirth, his birth. And because of that, his father resented him and wanted nothing to do with him. And so you find out early in the story that this was a boy who had never known the love of parents. He did have one person in his life who loved him, and that was his older sister, his only sibling. Her name was Fan, and she would come to visit him every so often, but she also died at a very young age. And then eventually, Ebenezer Scrooge falls in love, and he's engaged, but then his fiancée breaks up with him. And so as the story begins, you get this glimpse of his past, and you begin to understand that he was a man who was held captive by his past. And he began to cope with the hurt and with the rejection by turning inward and becoming selfish and devoting his life entirely to the pursuit of wealth. See, he allowed his past to dictate his future, and I believe that every single one of us can do the same thing. You see, what we can do is we can drag our past into the present, and then we can allow it to define the people that we become. And so today, I want to give you a truth. I want to give you a word of encouragement. I want to give you a truth that you can declare to your own heart, to your own mind, when the ghosts of your past begin to haunt you. It is simply this: that my past may remind me, but it will not define me. I want to really burn this into your brain cells. So on every campus, let's say this together, okay? I want you to say it out loud with me. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. My past may remind me, but it will not define me. Okay, that wasn't bad, but Clark Summit was a little bit weak, so we need to do it again. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. My past may remind me, but it will not define me. Okay, I want you to think for a moment about your own past. I want you to look back in time and think about the events and the circumstances of your past. I think for every single one of us, there are 3 categories, there are 3 types of events and circumstances that make up our past. First of all, there is the good. The good would be those blessings that have come into your life in the past. Maybe you had the blessing of a strong family. Maybe you had the blessing of good health. The good would be the blessings that have come into your life. It may also be your personal accomplishments. Maybe you had career success or academic success. The good could also be the good that you've done for other people, the way that you have blessed other people. And as difficult as your life may be, I think every single one of us can look back and we can see in our past that there are times when God has been very good to us. So there's the good, but then there's a second category called the bad. The bad would be the mistakes that you've made, the sins that you've committed, the things that you are not proud of, the things that you don't like to talk about. And we all have those things in our past. We all have those days in our past that we wish we could go back and live over again. And so there's the good, there's the bad, and there's the ugly for all the Clint Eastwood fans. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And the ugly would be the stuff that happened to you that you had no control over, the stuff that hurt you deeply. It may be the accident or the illness that took away your health, that you had no control over that. It may be the people who abused you or deserted you, or the people who cheated you. Those things in our past, the ugly, the hurt that came into our lives. And I think all of us, if we look back on our past, we could see both the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that's just the way that life goes in this very, very broken world. But here's the danger. The danger is that what so many of us can do is we can take our past and we drag it into our future and we allow it to define us. We drag it into the present, it defines our future. For instance, you may look back on your past and you have a past that, to be honest, is full of a lot of just painful and ugly stuff. I mean, there were things done to you that you had no control over, and those things affected you deeply. But here's the problem. When you drag the ugly of your past into your present, what will begin to define you is this: anger. And maybe for you, it's kind of a low-level anger that simmers just beneath the surface. It comes out in your cynicism, your sarcasm. There's always an edge to everything. Maybe for you, it's the kind of anger where you just kind of blow up at people and you damage all kinds of relationships. But because of the ugly of your past that you've carried with you into the present, you just go through life with this feeling that you've been ripped off, and your anger has begun to define you. Maybe for you, you look back in your past and you see a lot of bad. There are just some things that you've done that you're not proud of, that you don't talk about, that you don't want anybody to know about. And the list is long. But here's the thing: if you carry the bad from your past into your present, it will begin to define you, and you will be defined by shame. You'll begin to believe that nobody can love you, especially not God. And you'll begin to just exist in this world instead of moving into the calling that God has for you, the destiny that God has for you, because you're going to begin to believe that it's just too late for you. Or maybe for you, you look back on your past and you can see a lot of good, and I hope that's the case for you. But do you know that even this can be dangerous? Because we can become defined by pride. Because we can look back to our past and we can think that all that good was because of me and me alone. And we can forget the times when we asked God for His blessing and cried out to God for His help. And we forget the other people that have come alongside of us, and we become proud and entitled because our past is so good. And in our pride, we become insensitive. And we meet somebody who's got a lot of bad in their past. And we become a little bit judgmental and condemning because how could you do that? Or we come across we meet somebody who's got a lot of ugly in their past, and we think, come on, it can't be all that bad. You just need to get over it, because we've never experienced that. See, I don't know what your past holds, but I do know this. It's okay for it to remind you, but you must never let it define you, okay? It's kind of like when you're driving a car. When you're driving a car, you're looking at two things. You're looking at a windshield and you're looking at a rearview mirror. And a rearview mirror is important because you got to look in it every once in a while to see what's behind you. But if you drive your car constantly looking in the rearview mirror, you're not going to drive very well and you're not going to get very far. See, the reason why the windshield is so big and the mirror is so small is because what's behind you is not nearly as important as what's in front of you. What's in your past is not nearly as important as what's in your future. Are you all understanding what I'm saying? Do you get this? You can clap for that if you want to. Your past, it may remind you, but it should never, ever define you. Now, I want to point your attention to the story of a man whose story is told in the Bible, who struggled with his past. He was one of the most famous people in the Bible, and even if you didn't grow up in church, even if you've never read the Bible, you probably know something about him. His name was Moses. Moses, as you may know, was the one that God had chosen to deliver the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And so Moses was chosen to be the leader of God's people. He was chosen to be the deliverer of God's people. But before Moses could deliver anybody, God had to deliver Moses from some stuff in his past. Now, the story of Moses is told way back at the beginning of the Bible in the book of Exodus. It covers a whole bunch of chapters. And so today, for time's sake, we're going to look at what I would call the Reader's Digest version, the Cliff's Notes version, the Spark Notes version of his story. It's found in Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse 20. If you have a Bible, you can turn there or bring that up on a Bible app, or you can just follow along on the screens if you'd like to learn that way. Okay, so Acts chapter 7, what this is actually a message. And the person speaking it is Stephen, one of the first disciples, and he's rehearsing the history of God's people all the way up to the Messiah coming. And here in the middle, he talks about Moses and just tells the story in a very fascinating way. So let me jump in here, verse 20. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child because his birth came about in a very odd and somewhat confusing way. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. And so if you know the story of Moses, you know that he was born during a very dark time in the history of the Jewish people. At this time, the Jewish people were slaves in the Egyptian empire. But the Jewish population had grown to the point where they actually outnumbered the Egyptian people. And so the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, was feeling a little bit threatened by that, so he passed a law that every little boy born to a Jewish mother had to be put to death. But Moses had a mom who loved him and who was very creative, and so what she did is she put Moses actually into a basket and floated him in the Nile River, and Pharaoh's daughter found him there. She took him in. She adopted him, made him her own son. Here's what I want you to understand. Moses had some ugly in his past. He was born into a world in which his people were slaves, they were mistreated, they were being put to death, and so just to survive, he had to be torn away from his family, torn away from his own people. Let me tell you what, that would mark you. That would affect you. I think it affected him. He had some ugly in his past. But then the story goes on, verse 22, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. So he not only had some ugly in his past, he also had some good. He was raised in a palace. He was given the finest food, the best medical care. He was given the best education anywhere in the world at that time. I mean, life was good for him at this point. But even though so many things about his life were good at this point, there was still something going on in his heart. He was still searching for something because he was a man who didn't really belong anywhere. He was raised in an Egyptian home, but he knew he wasn't Egyptian. He was of the Jewish race, but he couldn't associate with his own people because they were slaves. And so he didn't really fit anywhere, and this troubled him, and it began to boil up in his heart, and one day it boiled over. Verse 23, when Moses was 40 years old, And by the way, something strange happens to guys when they hit 40 years old. It's when they buy the Bowflex, order the Harley Davidson, start getting the chemicals for the gray hair, they get unsettled. Moses was 40 years old, and he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He wants to figure out where he belongs and where he fits and who he is. He wants to reconnect with his past. And in trying to make a connection with his past, he does something very impulsive and very irrational. Here's what he does, verse 24. He saw one of them being mistreated, one of his own people being mistreated by an Egyptian. So he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. And verse 25 gives you some insight into his heart, into what he was thinking at this point. It says, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. In other words, Moses was hoping that somehow if he presented himself as the defender of his own people, that they would accept him and they would embrace him and he would be welcomed back where he truly belonged, but they didn't. They still viewed him as an outsider, and this whole thing just completely backfires. Look at verse 26. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? You thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" That's right, Moses. We know what happened. Everybody's talking about it. Ezekiel put it up on his Twitter account. 140 characters. He told everybody about it. So now, Moses not only has some ugly in his life and some good in his life, now he's got a boatload of bad in his life. Because everybody knows what he did, and pretty soon Pharaoh's going to find out what he did. And so here's what Moses does. He runs from his past. When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. So Moses runs. He goes hundreds of miles away from Egypt. He goes to a place called Midian. Midian was in the middle of the Arabian desert. Let me show you a picture. This is what Midian looks like. Far cry from the palaces of Egypt. This is where he ends up. Go back to verse 29. I want you to notice a 2-word phrase. He fled to Midian, where he settled. He settled. See, that's what we all do when we think we've blown it. We settle. We settle for a mediocre existence. We settle for a life that is far below what God wants to do through us. We settle for living the kind of life where we expect little from ourselves and anticipate and attempt very little. Moses just kind of settled. And out there in Midian, there aren't a lot of jobs. The job market is not thriving in the middle of the desert. So he has one option. He goes to work for his father-in-law as a shepherd. Go back to Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. So he marries this girl, and his father-in-law says, "Well, I probably need to give the dude a job, so go watch the sheep, would you?" I mean, that was an entry-level job. They weren't even his sheep. They were his father-in-law's sheep. And this was not a job that took a lot of education or skill or training. It was a job any kid could do. So think about the contrast here. When he was in Egypt, he was powerful, he was connected, he was influential. Now that's all gone. Now he's 40 years old, out in the middle of a desert, doing a job that any teenager could do. And he feels like he's at the end. He feels like he's hit a dead end. In fact, there's a very interesting detail in the story of Moses that gives us a glimpse into his heart and tells us volumes about where he was at this point in his life. You remember he got married and got a job with the father-in-law, and then he had 2 sons. And listen to what he named his firstborn son, Zipporah. That was his wife. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I've become an alien in a foreign land." Named his son Gershom. Gershom literally means, "I don't belong here." And I think he meant that more than just geographically. I think Moses felt like, this is not where I expected to be at this point in my life. This is not where I wanted to end up. I'm supposed to be in a palace, not in the middle of a desert watching these crummy sheep. This is not where I was supposed to be. This is not the life I had imagined for myself. I don't belong here. And you just get the sense that deep down in his heart, there's just this sense of regret about where life had taken him. He felt like he had no future. And I think every single one of us can feel that same way. I think we can all come to the point where we are so consumed by our past that we feel like we have absolutely no future. But if you know the story of Moses, you know this isn't the end of his story, is it? In fact, let me keep reading verse 30. After 40 years had passed. I want you to stop and do the math with me, okay? A few minutes ago, we read that he left Egypt and fled to Midian when he was 40 years old. 40 more years had passed. How old is he at this point? This guy is 80 years old. He has spent the last 40 years of his life watching somebody else's sheep out in the middle of the desert, feeling like there's no future for him. Forgotten. Neglected. And then God comes along in a burning bush and God says, listen, Moses, believe it or not, I got a job for you, got a future for you. I got a destiny for you. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. Of course, it was burning, but it didn't burn up. As he went over to get a closer look, he heard the Lord say, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And he has this God encounter. And then God says to him, I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. I want you to hear something. God says, I have heard their groaning. I will send you. I've heard their groaning. I will send you. He's saying, Moses, I want you to be the answer to the prayers of my people. Now, if you're here today and you're a follower of Christ, can I ask you to think about something? This may be a radical thought for you to think about, but let me ask you this. Is God waiting for you to be the answer to somebody's prayers? Is it possible that there's somebody in your life who's just searching for hope and praying for some spiritual direction, and God is just waiting for you to be the answer to that person's prayer? Is there maybe somebody in your neighborhood who's in a financial crisis and you have the ability to do something about it, and they're praying, but God's waiting for you to be the answer to their prayers? I know we have staff and we have leaders among our volunteers here who pray all the time for people to step forward and to serve and to help us as part of the crew to advance the mission of this church, maybe in a kids class or musically or whatever it might be. Are you the answer to someone else's prayer, and God is just waiting for you to say yes? Like if you were to see a burning bush and God were to speak to you and ask you to do something, what would he ask you to do? What's he waiting for you to do? What's your mission? What's your calling? Why are you still there in the desert if God is speaking to you? He speaks to Moses and he says, Moses, listen, I want you to go back to your past because I want to rewrite a better future for you. I want you to go set my people free. I've heard their groaning, and I want to send you. Now listen to how Moses responds. If you know the story, you know this. Go back again to the book of Exodus. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? In other words, he says, God, I really appreciate this midday interruption to an otherwise arduous and monotonous task. But God, you got the wrong guy. Who am I? And I think deep down inside his heart, he was thinking, God, if you had come to me 40 years ago, when I was strong, when I had connections, when I was powerful, when I had a vision for my life, God, if you had come to me 40 years ago, then I could have helped you, but not anymore. See, God, now I'm just a shepherd. I'm a fugitive out here in the middle of the desert. I'm nobody. Who am I? Can I tell you something? The enemy will use your history to stir up your insecurity. Every time. The enemy will use your history to stir up your insecurity. He'll try to convince you because of your past, you have no future. And Moses says, who am I? Now, I want you to notice how God, in this burning bush conversation, responds to him in verse 12. And I want you to notice what he doesn't say. God doesn't say, oh, come on, Moses, you're just being too hard on yourself. You need to think positive thoughts. Believe in yourself. Today is the first day of the rest of your life. You know, he doesn't say anything like that. Here's what he said. And God said, I will be with you. You know what that means? He's essentially saying this. Yeah, you're right, Moses. I mean, we both know you're not up to the task. Let's just be honest about it. But it isn't up to you. I will be with you. See, here's what I don't want you to hear me saying today, okay? Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying get up and get back at it, believe in yourself, you've got what it takes. Okay, that's not the point of the message. The point of the message is not that we are so special and we are so awesome and we are so great that we can do whatever we want to do. No, the point is not that at all. The point is this, that we serve a God. If we are followers of Christ, we serve a God who is so great and so awesome and so powerful that he can take even the worst of our past and he can take it in his hands, and if we're willing to follow his leadership, he can rewrite our future and he can do amazing things through us. In fact, I believe that God uses our past to prepare us for our future. Because that's what he did with Moses, right? I mean, think about it. He spent the first 40 years of his life in Egypt, in the palace, where he learned the culture, learned the language of the Egyptians. He was going to need to know that if he was going to go back and broker a deal with the Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go. It's a good thing he had those 40 years in Egypt. But then he had 40 years out in the desert of Midian. He needed that. He needed that because even though he thought he was just herding sheep, he was actually in a 40-year leadership development course. Because out there in the desert, away from the spotlight, away from the notoriety, as a humble shepherd, Moses learned the value of humility, and he would need that as a leader because he was going to be criticized constantly, and he would need to be humble enough to absorb it and to continue on in the direction that God had called him to go. And out there in the desert, in the monotony and the drudgery of the everyday tasks that he had to endure, he learned patience. And he was going to need patience because he was going to lead hundreds of thousands of people who were whining constantly because they had never known freedom before. And out there in the desert of Midian, he spent most of his time alone with God, and he learned to walk deeply with God, and he learned to listen to his voice. Those 40 years were not wasted years. Those 40 years were training that shaped his character and prepared him to be the man that he needed to be. See, Moses thought his past was pointless, but his past wasn't pointless. His past was his preparation. You may think your past is pointless. You may look back on the bad and the ugly and the pain and the wasted years, and you may think to yourself, that was pointless. No, that wasn't pointless. That was your preparation. That was your preparation for the future that God may still have for you. Years ago, my family and I went to Yosemite National Park out in California when we were on a trip. And at the southern edge of the park, they have this grove of these huge, giant redwood trees. They're fascinating, some of them like almost 2,000 years old. And we took this tour, and the park ranger showed us one of these trees, a smaller one of these trees that had been cut, and he showed us a cross-section. And he talked about the fact that, that you can look at the rings of a tree, and the rings of the tree tell the history of the tree. That the rings tell the story of its life. And wherever you have a wide ring, that was a year when there was lots of rain and lots of growth. And wherever you have a thin ring, that was a year of drought. And sometimes you can see where there was a fire because there's some scarring from where the fire took its toll on the tree. And sometimes you can see in a particular ring the work of insects that were really heavy on a particular year. Every ring showed the history of that tree, but every single ring was necessary to the eventual growth of that tree. And I wonder if other people could somehow see a cross-section of our lives and they could see all those rings, what they would see. Maybe they would see the ring of when you were growing up in school and you hated to go because you were bullied and you were called names constantly. Or maybe it would be the ring of scar from the absence of ever hearing a dad say, I love you, or having a mom who could never quite bring herself to say, I'm proud of you. Or maybe it would be the rings of those years when life was going good and you were content and there was joy and you felt God's smile on you. Or maybe it would be the ring when your spouse slammed the door for the last time and never came back. And all of those rings are a part of your story, but all of those rings create the person you are today. And see, I believe that as with Moses, the same is true with all of us, that God can take the good and the bad and the ugly of our lives, and He can use all of it to prepare you for the future. And so God comes to Moses. He says, I got a job for you. And there's a long conversation that takes place. You'll have to read about that sometimes sometime. And eventually Moses says, okay. And he goes to Egypt. He confronts the Pharaoh. A fascinating story, a series of plagues. Eventually, God's people go free. They're wandering through the wilderness for a really long time because it was led by a bunch of men, and they didn't stop and ask for directions. And actually, that's not what happened. But eventually, they get to the promised land, and they settle in there. Hundreds of years go by. And then a baby boy is born in that promised land in a little town called Bethlehem. We celebrate his birthday at this time of the year. And that little boy grows up to be a man, and at about the age of 30, he begins to travel throughout Israel. He begins to teach. He begins to heal people. He begins to declare the coming of God's kingdom, and he surrounds himself with disciples. And when Jesus surrounds himself with disciples, do you know what kind of people he chose? People with a past, tax collectors, prostitutes, uneducated fishermen. He chose the most unlikely people in the world to create the greatest movement in the world. And then he went to a cross. And he took with him to that cross all the good and the bad and the ugly of your past and my past. And he bore our shame. And he gave us forgiveness. And he gave us the ability to live for his purposes. And I want to leave you with one more verse of Scripture. These words were written by Paul the Apostle. Paul was a guy with a past. Paul had spent a good part of his life persecuting Christians. He would hunt them down, throw them into jail, sometimes actually kill them. And eventually he had this incredible confrontation with Jesus and a conversion in his heart that happened in a moment. And he goes from killing Christians to then leading Christians. And he starts all these churches, and he writes 13 letters, which are now part of the Bible. And in one of those letters to the believers in Rome, he says this. He says, we know that in all things, the good, bad, and the ugly, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Meaning he has a purpose for you. Regardless of your past, he has a purpose for you, and he will take whatever's in your past and work all of that together for good so that you can accomplish that purpose. We're going to end our time of worship today with the celebration of communion. And for those of you who are new to Parker Hill, let me just tell you a little bit about how this works and what this means. On every campus, there are 4 tables in the room, 2 at the front, 2 at the back. And on each one of those tables, there are pieces of bread and there are bowls of juice. The bread is representative of the body of Christ. That juice is representative of his blood. And for those of us who are Christians, these are powerful, powerful symbols of our faith. They are reminders of the fact that we were unconditionally loved by a Savior who went to a cross and then left behind an empty tomb. And if you're here with us today and you're a follower of Christ, you're welcome to participate. If you're not yet a believer, feel free to sit and observe, or if you're just not prepared in your heart to participate, that's okay. Let everybody else go by. In just a couple of minutes, the band is going to come back, and they're going to sing a last song, and the ushers will dismiss everyone a row at a time toward the front or toward the back. And as you come to that table, you take a piece of that bread, you dip it in that juice, and as you hold it, as you taste it, let it be a connection in your heart to the love of God expressed on a cross, and let it be a reminder of who you are. You're not defined by your past. You're not defined by the good and the bad and the ugly of your life, because Christ took all that to the cross with him. You're defined by who you are in him, his beloved son or daughter, forgiven and made brand new. See, your past may remind you, but it does not need to define you.